Hello, people. Today here I have the pleasure and honor to receive Robert Barnes. He is a lawyer, a giant slayer, a legal crusader, constitutional lawyer, civil trial, and criminal tax versus big banks, laws, and governments. Thank you very much, Robert, for coming.
Glad to be here.
Robert Barnes, if you guys don't know him, he's a lawyer that is always hanging up with Viva Fry, the Canadian lawyer that I have interviewed before, and he's up to 200,000 followers on Twitter. And Barnes laws and fighting for the freedom that founded America. And I like the what Dave Rubin, the Rubin report wrote about one of the central figures in the free speech battle today, and that's why you're here. And we're going to talk about a lot of things, not only free speech. Uh, the conversations with Viva and Nate, we're going to approach a little bit, and I want you to maybe, if we have time, brush a little bit on your important cases on Convignon lawsuit, Wesley Snipes versus the IRS. But the important point, and I think you brought us here today, is the USA elections and all the conversation around the evidence of fraud. Are there reliable evidence of fraud in the USA elections, and that would be substantial enough to change the results?
So the legal standard in each of the states is whether or not there are more votes in doubt than the margin of victory. And for that, there's three categories of votes to be looked at. First, did only qualified voters vote? And this means that, and that varies by state, but usually it requires they be of a certain age, at least 18 at the time of election day, requires that they only be registered in that state. They can't be registered to vote in another state. They need to be a legal resident of that state. They need to be a legal citizen of the United States. And of course, they have to be alive, and they can only vote once. In this context, there are a lot of questions about whether only qualified voters voted. And the secondary question is whether so many unqualified voters voted as to be greater than the margin of victory in the contested states. The second question is whether the ballots were lawfully cast. So this includes, so there's certain ways you can vote. So if you're going to vote in person, you have to vote in a particular time, within a certain time frame, on certain days, at a certain locations. You have to check in. You often have to show identification. You have to mark the ballot in a particular way. If you vote absentee, there's other rules that govern that process. If you vote by mail, we've always had constitutional concerns about voting by mail because it's not a secret ballot, or it doesn't have to be. Someone can watch it. Someone can buy it. Someone can blackmail a person, coerce a person. Someone can vote for somebody else without their notice or knowledge. Someone can replace a ballot, even that may be signed correctly, but inside it's a different ballot than the one the person actually filled out. So there's a lot of concerns there, and the question is whether a ballot is lawfully cast is whether they voted either properly at the proper time and place in person or by the proper methods and means if done by mail or absentee. And then the third question is whether the ballots are counted in a constitutionally conforming manner. This includes making sure that there are observers present, party observers present, independent members of the public present to monitor what's called the canvassing process, which includes looking at whether the signatures match, whether the ballot inventory has been correct, whether the chain of custody of the ballots has been secure and protected from any form of infiltration or other intrusion, and to make sure the actual counting of the ballots is done in a constitutionally consistent manner that is accurate to the actual vote totals. In this election, there are 6 states where there have been a contest, 3 where the margin is very, very small. About 10,000 votes in Arizona out of millions cast, at 10,000 votes in Georgia out of millions cast, 20,000 out of Wisconsin out of millions cast, and a slightly bigger margin, but still close margins in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, where election contests have also been raised. In Category 1, there is more than 10,000 ballots that are in question by people who are not qualified to vote, according to the research done by Matt Brainerd and Richard Barris, independently confirmed with a statistically significant sample size by a range of survey metrics and other data research points, including voter registration files, change of address files, obituary files, age, date of birth files, etc. People who voted twice, people who voted in multiple states, people who voted twice within the same state, dead people who purportedly cast ballots, people who weren't 18 who cast ballots, criminal felons who weren't qualified to vote casting ballots, people from insane asylums casting ballots. So all of whom were not constitutionally qualified to vote in the relevant state. And the number of votes they found in question was greater than the margin of victory in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. It was a little bit closer in Nevada and in Michigan. Then you have the second category of ballots illegally cast. Here, no independently confirmed monitored signature match check occurred in any swing state in any county by anybody. There has been claims that they match the signatures, but they won't let anybody look at the signatures. The one place that allowed a statistically significant sample size was Phoenix in Arizona. The judge ordered it. The Democrats' own expert came in and said at least 11% of the signatures did not match. A ballot cannot count constitutionally or legally if the signature does not match the registration file. If 11% of the signatures don't match in Arizona, that's 30 times more questionable ballots than the margin of victory in Arizona. We can reasonably infer the same numbers in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia. In the same capacity, in Wisconsin, people were listed and identified as being, quote, indefinitely confined, which was supposed to be limited to people who literally physically, medically could not get to the polling place. This did not include COVID as an excuse. More than 100,000 people cast those ballots. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ultimately admitted that they should not have been allowed to cast ballots, but they just didn't do any remedy for the president. But so in Wisconsin, in Arizona, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, more unlawfully cast ballots than the margin of victory. Then you go to the third category, where more ballots counted in an unconstitutional manner than was authorized under the law or than is the margin of victory. We find the same pattern in all the key states. In Wisconsin, in Milwaukee County, they counted the ballots outside of the presence of independent monitors, and they counted more ballots than constituted the margin of victory. Same problem in Michigan, especially in Wayne County, where over almost 200,000 ballots were counted without being independently monitored. Same problem in Pennsylvania, where it happened in both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Same problem in Atlanta, where they went to great lengths to get people to leave, to tell people there was a water leak. Then they pulled out the ballots, as people have now seen on the video, from underneath the tables and started counting them and running them through the machine with extraordinary, as you've noted, statistical margins that nobody saw coming, not even the media or the press. And then there have been some problems like that in some other states, but particularly Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia and Nevada were the most egregious offenders of not allowing monitoring of either the count or the canvass. The canvass is supposed to check the signatures. They didn't allow that in any of those states. So all you need is one of those three categories to have more questionable ballots than the margin of victory, or the aggregate of the three. Here, each of the three by themselves had more questionable ballots than were the margin of victory. And the legal standard, the constitutional standard, is that those electors cannot count when the electors from those states are constitutionally in question and in doubt. And that's a tradition that goes all the way back to 1796.
Wow. Yeah, so it's interesting that you just laid down everything. Thank you very much. It was a great explanation, because I tried to just have an objective analysis with Yarenbrook that is an objectivist, and I wanted just to lay down like what are the evidence that are reliable, what is actually, if there is planted fake evidence just to balance this trust on the election's integrity. Where are those points? Where are the fake evidence? Which ones are the fake evidence and which ones are the good? And the point was like, oh, the argument that apparently everybody that's anti-Trump and would be happy even if the elections were stolen, that Trump is just going to be replaced. And that's what scares me, that people become so tribalist on the point that does not care about the transparency and honesty on the elections and just want their team to win. That is something I wanted to approach with you, to say like, yeah, if there is such fake evidence, we should at least go through examining that. That is normally what would be a judicial proper process would be. So, and when the argument of, oh no, the cases, the evidence are being dismissed by the judge because it's all a bunch of garbage or a bunch of planted fake evidence against the elections, it's not really the point. And I didn't really want to argue at that in the interview because we want to interview him. But here we can dig a little bit more to for you to explain to us what is this process, what's going on. Apparently, what I believe to be so is that the evidence are not being even examined when they are talking about these cases being dismissed. Is the judge is just throwing the entire case without even looking at the evidence? Is that, can you explain to us how did they dismiss so many cases and why?
So there's two different issues present. One is that a lot of allies of the president have brought a wide range of legal challenges that are separate from the president's own challenges. The only process that has an evidentiary method or mechanism available to it is an election contest. But in Arizona and Nevada, where the election contests were filed, the court did not allow certain evidence to be presented or change the legal standards to require someone to prove something that's impossible. To give you an example, the law is that if the signatures don't match, the ballots have to be thrown out. The judge's own statistically significant standard said that there was 30 times more questionable ballots, according to the Democrats' own expert, than was the margin of victory. So what does the judge do? He changes the standard. He says, no, now I'm going to force you to prove forgery. Anybody who knows the evidentiary standards for forgery are, it is impossible to prove forgery with only a few specimen samples and signatures. You need hundreds of specimen samples to be able to prove criminal forgery. So the judge deliberately created a standard that's not the law, that's never been the law, just so he could avoid the consequences of his own judicial fact-finding. So when in the very few instances they've heard any evidence at all, like in the election contest in Nevada and Arizona, a little bit of some quasi-evidentiary hearings in some cases that don't involve the president but involve other allies of the president, they have never conducted, they've either changed the legal standard so that all of a sudden you're put on a burden of proving something you can't prove. In Nevada, for example, they had over 100,000 questionable ballots in one way, shape, or form. So what does the judge do? He says, well, unless you get to depose all 100,000 people in 3 days, I'm not going to count that as evidence. So that's the kind of things that it's procedural shenanigans that courts have engaged in. Now, the best complaint, the best election contest, the only one brought actually by the president himself is in Georgia. Thousands of pages of supporting affidavits. It is so intimidating to the Democrats and the courts that they have refused to schedule a trial on that election contest, even though by law it had to be scheduled within 5 days. And the courts are just pretending it will just go away somehow. So if they had confidence in the evidence, we would have actual trials, an actual jury trial, an actual bench trial. They would allow meaningful discovery, a right of cross-examination. It's always the case that if you don't allow cross-examination, if you don't allow discovery, if you don't allow subpoenas, if you don't allow a jury trial, if you don't allow a trial period, then any conclusion you bring is not based on the evidence. It's based on some legal procedural trick. So when all of these various Trump critics are saying, oh, the courts heard it and they rejected it, not on the evidence they didn't, because they didn't allow the evidence to come in to be relevant to the trial proceedings. They never conducted a single trial in a single case. So it's just a misleading misnomer for them to go that way. And what they're really arguing is an appeal to authority, a pitch to power. It's not an argument from principle. It's not an argument based on the facts or the law or the evidence. It's an argument that, hey, the people in power are on our side. Well, by that argument, every civil rights case brought between 1875 and 1949 was frivolous because every court rejected every single civil rights argument for 70 years. Were the courts right, or was Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement right? I would say the civil rights movement was right. Just because people in power are willing to screw over the president, that speaks to those people in power, does not speak to the evidentiary or legal quality of the president's arguments.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that explanation that I tried to argue with Yaron, was I see a bunch of cases being dismissed, and I asked him if he didn't believe there was such a bias involved, a personal political bias in this equation of like all these cases being dismissed without even checking the evidence. And I guess it is what you're just saying. They are actually clearly going around the principle, the law itself, changing the principle to fit the thing that is not right now. Instead of, yes, since that something is wrong, let's investigate and see what is. It's like, oh no, it's going to take so much, it's so much more work, and it could be bad according to many people previews of what could happen if they change the results, or if they say the results was never, the election was never concluded. And what pisses me off is that Trump was being persecuted online for saying, for even mentioning like, oh, I could have won, when people were saying Biden won without the elections being finished. And it's still not, but so many people stated that Biden won, and that's it. Uh,
Uh, yeah, I mean, and no doubt about it. I mean, and really what it is the president did not have many institutional allies. So the leaders of the Senate, the leaders of the House on the Republican and Democratic side, the leaders in a lot of governors and secretaries of state and election officials, even those that were nominally Republican, are anti-Trump and want Trump out. And so it was a problem he faced throughout his entire 4 years, is that his own cabinet members were constantly undermining him. His own appointees were constantly undermining him. His own Justice Department hid and covered up the Biden scandal while making sure nothing happened with the Spygate scandal, and then came out and pretended there was no fraud when they hadn't even investigated anything. So it's the weakness of a populist rebellion or revolution politically is that it's often opposed by the professional class. The judges are made up of the professional managerial class. They are the biggest seat of opposition to Trump. And even people that Trump appointed, those judges are more loyal to Mitch McConnell than they are to Donald Trump. And that's what happened. And people
that is
thought
one
that, oh,
good
well, if Trump's own appointees rejected the argument, that must mean the argument is incredulous. No, it means that those people are just like the judges who betrayed the civil rights movement for 70 years from 1870 to 1940.
Yeah, and the Republicans that would be anti-Trump, like just like you mentioned, like the ones that are more Mitch McConnell than Trump, would be that they are more establishment than what Trump represents. Trump represents the non-establishment. He was the whatever other guy that decided to be politician, and they were all laughing and trying to keep him away from that even before, even with these new things about Obama meetings with Biden in closed doors to try to stop Trump from. If that was the what would happen today, Trump tried to stop anybody from becoming president. Imagine, and nobody talks about this, and the mainstream media keeps building this thing that most of people will believe, just to peace. And I don't know, I don't actually think that is the way to peace, because we see that if the things get in track and we end up having justice, most of people would feel that Trump was the one that stole the elections in the end, when most of people just want to walk away from any evidence that would point the elections were stolen and by Biden. One of my questions, and more of a statement, I would say, is how we can see this bias, because apparently there are evidence that would people trying to do the fraud for Trump side. And I keep questioning myself why the Democrats are not curious to solve this, the fraud, because it could be, oh no, now it's just because Biden won. So it's like, it's not even about transparency or being honest, or really for the integrity of the elections. It's just my side won, I'm happy with this, look away and keep going. And no, that is, it breaks down the entire principle of the government, of the transparency, the honesty that we expect from the biggest institutions.
No doubt about it. I mean, what's amazing is after Bush v. Gore and the debacle of Florida in 2000, the United States Congress passed something called the HOPE Act in 2002 that formed the United States Election Assistance Commission. And its goal and objective as this independent, bipartisan, or nonpartisan commission and forming blue ribbon committees was to come up with the best protocols and procedures to govern elections. They, along with the Citizens Integrity Project, along with the international election observers under the authority of either the UN or the OSCE, came up with a bunch of standards that said, here's how we're going to govern our elections. Here's what makes a transparent election, an honest election, an open election. And the first thing they recommend is that there be independent monitoring across the board, that they do have party observers present throughout the entire process, that the public is knowledgeable, informed, and has complete, transparent access to every aspect of the election machinery, of taking in the votes, of counting the votes, of calculating the votes, of making sure it's in a lawfully cast vote by a lawfully qualified voter, counted in a lawfully counted manner. And that includes, for example, when the Georgia Secretary of State wrote a $106 million taxpayer check to Dominion, he said in 2018, he said, don't worry, because of this, we're now going to have all of our ballots have a paper record, and they're all going to be digitized and scanned. And so because of that, I will publish the ballots to the world so that everyone can see them, every single ballot, anytime we have an election issue in the future. Well, 2 years later, 2020, the president's campaign is asking for him to do that, and he's refused. And so the problem of the system is that the secretaries of state and the election officials did not have independent monitors involved in making sure only qualified voters cast ballots, did not have independent monitors involved in making sure the votes were lawfully cast, particularly as to the signature match check process, and did not have independent monitors even in the counting process, and went to great lengths to exclude them in Philadelphia, to exclude them in Detroit, to exclude them in Milwaukee, to exclude them in Atlanta. Why go through all of those attempts to withhold transparent information, attempts to hide and obfuscate, unless they're up to something bad? If they weren't hiding about anything, why did they hide? If they're not lying about anything, why did they lie? And what it's done is, as you note, it's discredited our elections, and it's discrediting our judicial system. So it's one thing for all these executive officials to fail. It's another thing for our courts to fail. In America, our courts have said that they alone can determine what is constitutional. And yet the most debated clause in the Constitution, as the Supreme Court acknowledged just 2 years ago in a faithless elector case, was the electors clause. And yet that's the very clause they're refusing to adjudicate, even in cases where they are the only court that has jurisdiction, such as the Texas suit. And all of these courts coming up with procedural tricks like standing and mootness and ripeness and latches, none of which exist in the Constitution, none of which even showed up, like standing didn't even exist for the first 150 years of our judicial history. It's a fictional, fabricated judicial doctrine to play Pontius Pilate and not do their duties and obligations. And what's going to be the lasting effect? The lasting effect is going to be millions of Americans no longer believe in our judicial system either. And what happens when you have millions of Americans who don't believe in our elections and don't believe in our judicial system? That's usually not a good recipe for a government moving forward.
I believe a little bit that this is the most or the closest thing to what would be foreigner interference in the political field. When people keep talking about any type of collusion or attack or virtual attack, I believe that is the easiest way to implode a democracy or a strong democracy, as you guys have in the United States. And of course, I always like to remember people that it's a democratic republic. So the majority will not oppress the minorities, because people keep talking about how important it is to defend minorities, but they also keep claiming and yelling on top of the lungs about how the majority decides everything. It's like, wait a minute, we have this balance, and that's why we have democratic republic. And the political scenario of today, I think, is so troubling because we have left and right, the Democrats and Republicans, instead of working together, they think they are opposite forces and they have to destroy the other one, or that the other one is evil. And it's that is split culturally that they really demonize the other side, and it became just a tribal fight so bad that caused all this Trump derangement syndrome, all this reaction, even towards looking away from some type of a fraud, not want to solve such an important issue that would cause, I would say, is that okay to just keep going, as many people said, to just avoid any bad reaction from the majority? I don't think so, because like you mentioned, is that good to keep going and just not believe that the elections were properly done and lose the faith or the hope, and the trust on the system? It costs much more, I believe, for the country, for sure. And is that invisible thing that we cannot really measure, just like a little bit of the results of authoritarian measurements from all the reaction on corona or covid-19, and that they keep saying like, no, we're still protecting you, and we were like, no, you're harming us more. We just cannot really shape it in a body and show you that the harm is bigger than the protection. And I think that would be the next conversation we're gonna try to talk a little bit, is how you are willing to fight more fascist governments this year. Is that your resolution for 2021? So let me know. Tell us a little bit about this. What you're talking about? How people can do uh, uh, break a little bit of this vicious cycle that we are in an authoritarian government, no matter left or right. We are walking towards this.
Well, I see the election constitutional crisis as a subsidiary of the broader COVID-induced constitutional crisis. So almost every core liberty is being threatened at levels that have never been threatened in America's constitutional history. Your First Amendment right of association is being removed and taken away unilaterally without even legislation being passed or public approval. Your right of religious expression is being taken away from you. Can't even sing in hymnals, can't even go to church, can't even gather together fellow believers. Your right of the press is being interfered and intruded all around the world. I mean, a woman in London, in the United Kingdom, filmed that a hospital was empty. The next day, the cops show up at her door. Similar things have
I
happened
would
here in.
love to talk. I saw that yesterday. I don't record who is which YouTuber I watched that was talking specific. I think it was Timple. He's talking about everything. So I believe it was Timple. He's all over the place. He's amazing. I hope I talk to him. But I saw, and that was one thing that me and my husband, we stopped the video to talk about. It's like, it's different of someone trespassing and being arrested by the police in the place red-handed would be. Then you recorded something in an empty place, you did not cause any disturbance and anything, and then after the police comes after you because of with all those charges they pile up against you, but more seem to be anti-free speech movement from the authorities. And
No,
yeah, and you
I
all
mean,
over.
in LA, they were the cop. Some folks were out just filming the emptiness of the streets on New Year's Eve. Cops showed up and threw them on the ground and arrested them and took them in. So this is insanity. So the no right to freedom of expression, no right to freedom of assembly, no right to for freedom of association, no right for freedom of the press, no right to petition your government, because the people, that's the other First Amendment right, the one that Amy Coney Barrett forgot about during her Senate confirmation hearings. But when Senator Sass asked her about those constitutional liberties, she couldn't remember that one. Unfortunately, it's one the courts tend to forget a lot, but it's the core of all of our freedoms. You couldn't even form for a political party. You can't even get on the ballot in certain cases because it's impossible, because they're imposing these high signature standards at the same
It
time.
seems to
They're
be
not allowing
easy
you to
for the
gather
people
signatures.
in power to forget the individual rights
Yes. Oh, yes, of
when they
course.
were in that position,
And
or
then you
at
had
least
in
when they
certain
were in that
cases,
position.
oh, no doubt. And then in certain cases, you had Second Amendment rights suspended because effectively what happened is they never got around to giving you your background check, so you couldn't get a gun for self-defense. Your Fourth Amendment right of privacy is being completely evaded. I mean, basic people, if you get a COVID test, it's being publicly disclosed to third parties, whether you got it. Now they're saying whether you get a vaccine is going to be publicly disclosed to third parties. This is an invasion of your medical privacy, which is as important as any other form of privacy. And not to mention the track and trace programs they're trying to institute, and some of even which want to put a chip in people to track and trace which vaccines they've had and haven't had. So We are facing the greatest onslaught against constitutional liberties, mass takings by the government without compensation or due process of law, in violation of the Fifth Amendment, not being able to be able to perform your occupation or perform your profession or even make a living to support your family. The state of Pennsylvania said in a federal suit that you have no right to make a living. That's the kind of arguments that are being made, arguments we haven't seen in American history. So the COVID pretext presents the greatest threat to our constitutional liberties, independent of and aside from, but on top of the election that we've ever experienced. And that's why that fight is going to define the contours of constitutional liberty and whether the constitutional democratic republic lives or dies in the next century.
That's amazing. It's definitely, I think it is one of the most important conversations for the next decade. More likely because we all have seem to be more involved in politics in the last decade, and I don't think it's just Trump's fault. A lot of people say, "Oh, it's Trump. It's like from 2016, fake news, the conversation about all this, you know." And I think Trump did something really good in the end. Just open up this. You don't need to be a politician. We all are politicians in our private and public life, and we should be involved in it, and not just voting, but sometimes going there and making it better. Because like you mentioned, the problem, what I think it became, politics became a career. So some people are politicians, and it's like, no, this should be a side job, because we all want to improve the government. It's made by people, so we need ourselves to work into it, but it should not be a career. As the same way we should not have lobbyists, that is another crazy thing, as a career. Because we're always talking about how bad these corporations get together with government, but then we create an entire profession that works into this network, into making more of what we know it's bad. It's crazy. How can we, for example, like what I keep talking to people is like, I believe I'm a libertarian, not a full libertarian. I know we cannot go through from what we have now to an anarchism, but I believe we are on the top line, in the front line of the time and space, and we are the ones to walk towards libertarianism more than people saying like, but you never seen a secular or a libertarian country. It's like, yeah, because we're gonna make it. We are the first ones. That's why we don't have examples, because we are good like that. We have, and just like you mentioned that we are evolving, I think it's the new revolution is the political revolution. As we pass through like industrial revolution, now we all involved in politics, and we normal people want to do more than just vote. And I think we all can. People in Brazil, some people that are more literate do that. They write political projects, give to politicians, send letters, and try to help a little bit more. But I see in from the system itself, and a little bit of the establishment that I believe Trump came to fight, is because a lot of little people that have good intentions sometimes fall into a network that is already built and end up becoming just corrupted politicians. We need to break that vicious cycle, and I think it is getting more people involved and finding or shaping better what is the role of the government. So according to the principles, as a lawyer and involved into those things, is that right to say that the government is there, as I keep repeating, that the government is there to defend the smallest minority, that is the individual, so it should never transgress our rights in the way that they are doing, as you mentioned, unprecedented punishment with masks and fines and transgressing people's liberty and freedom without precedents and without even having some justification. It's like, oh, preventive punishment. This never happened before. Can you talk a little bit on this instance?
So, yeah, there's two components there. One is that the professional class has their professional managerial class, as my friend Peter Lavelle would talk about them, from another good show called The Gaggle, which has another nice international perspective where you get a very independent, idiosyncratic, but an American informed and historically informed perspective. And what is the professional managerial class has really been at war with everyone else. and they co-opted politics beginning in the 90s. To give an and it's all throughout the West. To give an example, the Labor Party in the 1950s, a majority of its parliamentary members were blue-collar workers. They were miners, railroad workers, forms of engineers, fishermen. Today, they're almost all lawyers, doctors, people with PhDs, et cetera. So the professional, I call it the West Wing environment, because I saw it when the show The West Wing was becoming popular in the early 90s. I was there in D.C. as a young kid, and I was seeing that the professional class was popularizing politics as a way of life. And what they did is they took over everything within politics. They became the professional politicians, the professional candidates at every level of governance, from local county commission and city hall all the way up to the presidency, into the Senate, into the House, and the rest, governorships, you name it. They also took over the political class, the people in the press. The professionalization of journalism has done more damage to journalism than anything ever could. Instead of having people from diverse walks of life writing about people they knew, you had basically foreigners writing about people they did not know, trying to use their narrational capabilities as media members to create and craft a story rather than just tell a story. The same thing happened in terms of the political consultants and the pollsters and the media consultants. They all had the same professional class prejudice that led to professional class politics dominating both parties for the last 20 years or so. So one thing that needs to happen that Trump did help break down the door, as you mentioned, is to deprofessionalize the political class. More people from everyday walks of life running for office, campaigning for office, helping people campaign for office, building alternative tech platforms, all of that, being part of, like what you're doing, independent members of the press, crowdsourcing and grassrooting journalism once again, media commentary, public commentary, investigative discussion, bringing back the old salons of Europe for the Enlightenment that do not limit it to the halls of the power corridors of power at the big universities. All of that has to take place to help transform politics and to re-democratize politics wholesale. It basically comes down to the ordinary person taking action. The fifth pillar of power is always the perception of the other four pillars of power. And if people seize their own power in like a V for Vendetta kind of a movie way, cinematic way, then they'll discover that actually that they were the ones that always had the power. It was what Nelson Mandela tried to teach people. He said that, he learned when he was in prison, he kept repeating to himself that poem, that he was the captain of his own fate, that he was the master of his own destiny. And that by thinking of it and reframing the world in that way, though Scott Adams calls it framing, you're actually able to do things you never thought you could do and change the world in ways no one ever imagined possible.
Yeah. And you mentioned Scott Adams. I get like completely dragged by his Real Coffee with Scott Adams. And it's pretty good. Yeah. One of the things is that, what about how and you mentioned him, and then brought me to this question as well. This morning he read, someone wrote to him, what if hypothetically Biden gets the power and this happens? What actually yesterday, and you talk about idiosyncratic ideas, just yesterday me and my husband were talking about this. If this happens and then they find later undeniable evidence of a huge fraud, is still that the power will not go back to Trump, and the steps down the road are not better than Biden. Actually.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, once he's inaugurated, the only way he can be removed is by impeachment. And impeaching him only puts Kamala Harris in power. And if you impeach Kamala Harris, it only puts whoever the new vice president that she chose in power. Or in the alternative, under the 25th Amendment, it puts the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, as president. So unfortunately, there's no meaningful remedy if Biden is inaugurated on January 20th. If it turns out later he did steal, it's confirmed he stole the election.
Yeah. So I hope you guys can figure it out before don't go down the road. And so you think the most questionable now would be the judges not taking actions to make change, or you think that is personal, public, and it's a good thing? How do you see their, putting their shoes, because we understand there is a lot of pressure. The same way when I talk about how I don't think Corona should be politicized, and I don't think the politicians should have taken any measure, but I understand that the people always hold the politicians kind of responsible. If too many people died, you should have done something. So they have this popular pressure that makes them take some actions that sometimes are a mistake. It was a mistake to start depoliticizing and forcing masks or giving fines to people. But I understand sometimes that not justifying or excusing them, but just to understand the path of things going. You think that was justifiable, or you think, no, it's always, we need to stand for the principles even if you're the only one trying to find the truth?
My view is there's never any excuse for unconstitutional action. If in fact something is really obvious that needs to be done, that's what amending the Constitution is there for. There will be huge supermajorities in the states and in Congress if it truly is an honest emergency that requires exigent action. We now have governors issuing emergency orders 9 months after the emergency supposedly began. I mean, if we have for years, people used to make fun of and criticize Alex Jones and others by saying, oh, they're always saying that the politicians will use their emergency powers and abuse it. And they're like, oh, that will never happen. They'll never have an emergency that goes on for years. They'll never have an emergency that never gets passed by the legislature. They'll never have an emergency that suspends the Constitution. And yet that's exactly where we are in most states of the United States and most countries in the West. They have suspended almost all of their core liberties. They've done it now not just for days, not just for weeks, but for months and months and months, and we're heading into years. And so it shows the great risk. If it was the case that it was so obvious these reforms, these health measures needed to be passed, why won't any of these governors pass it through their state legislatures? Because almost none of them have been passed through their state legislatures. They're just governors issuing edicts like they're royal governors of the 15th century. Saying, oh, I declare this, I declare this. So that's problem one, is we set up this entire tricameral structure of government to have checks and balances, to require the legislative branch and then the executive branch and the judicial branch. And what we're seeing in COVID is how it has infected our constitutional system and diseased it to potential lethal consequences in ways that previewed what would happen in the elections, where the legislative branch didn't pass the rules that ultimately ended up getting just sort of unilaterally imposed by the executive branch. And then the judicial branch absconded and abandoned and hid under their desk. Scary, scary virus, basically, kind of mindset. And we're seeing the same thing happen throughout the COVID environment. That's problem one. Problem two is the complete lack of transparency and evidentiary methods. So these governors are coming up with rules, and what Judge Stickman found in the case out of Pennsylvania, which unfortunately the Third Circuit set aside, but he was the only one to have an actual hearing, a real trial, real discovery, real evidence on the question of COVID. And what he found is they didn't have any good evidence. They didn't go through any. He said it was basically an experiment on the population by a bunch of grad students who had no idea. They didn't go through the methodologies, the evidentiary mechanisms necessary to come to an objectively true decision. We have this entire legal process and political process established to have an adversarial process combined with the democratic process to come to objective truth. We're skipping all of it. And so should it be any surprise that we're having decisions that contradict each other within weeks or months? Don't wear masks? You must wear masks. Maybe wear masks. We're not sure. You must get a vaccine, but maybe the vaccine actually doesn't stop transmission of the virus, which is the only reason to force the vaccine. So the legal standards were supposed to be under quarantine law, under public health law, under mental health law. You have to present a clear and present and imminent danger to other people of such serious, substantial significance that the state can restrict your liberty, and even then can only do so by the means most narrowly tailored to achieve that compelling public interest. They haven't done any of that in any of the COVID cases.
Yeah, it is. For me, it's pessimistic, because if they're doing this for Corona, for COVID, that is not that of a disease, in my opinion, as a doctor, as a physician. it could be much worse. I cannot even imagine what's going to happen when another Ebola come around. So I'm scared of people's reactions for the panic demic, the panic reaction, the panic demic reaction, like this panic be this reaction, this fear be so strong that people actually uh, support the government to take these measures that for me are unreasonable. And their reason to support is because they are afraid. It's not more that they just don't know how not dangerous is, and they keep hearing a message from the mainstream media and the government that is dangerous and you should. Of course we all care. That's one of my points of being a libertarian, that I think if it was that dangerous, we would take actions before the government would need to tell us. And I think we need to start walking that way, just trying to talk to other people as what are the evidence, stop looking at what they are highlighting and look at everything else that's more optimistic. Speaking of Corona perspective, we
Well,
were
especially if
expecting.
we use our own lived experience. For example, they claim 1 out of 1,000 people have died because of COVID. I know of no one who has died because of COVID. I know of no friends or family members who know anyone who's died of COVID or who believe they've died of COVID. Apparently some of them have been listed as doing so. But how is it we have this great imminent risk when we all know people that have had COVID and had no problems? Very few of us know anyone who has died, and if we do, it's usually someone that was very old that was on death's door. So how is it that there could be this massive threat when none of our own lived experiences confirm that? And so it is the biggest gaslighting experiment in modern history, definitely maybe in world history as to public health, where we use the very techniques that in the past we've said the worst response would be panic. And yet that's what we've induced. And we've have a lot of excess deaths that are because of the lockdowns and because of the panic, not because of the pandemic itself.
Yeah, it is. It is sad, I would say, at least, to see everybody bending over the government authoritarian measures and trying to push that on people, and all due to fear and misinformation mostly, because we have the ways, we have the TV, we have the internet, we have all this stuff, but apparently some people that want to speak the truth are being shadow banned or being dismissed, is being discredited or canceled because they are not in the right narrative. Because doctors supposed to say, yes, corona is dangerous. Yes, it's dangerous, but dangerous to which conditions, comorbidities, and age. So let's do since the beginning of corona, like almost a year ago, I was like, I'm not convinced that it should be a general lockdown. And I mentioned tuberculosis, explaining how tuberculosis is a disease that is very dangerous, that is very uh, uh, fatal, that has asymptomatic transmission even after you start the medicine, and we use the proper masks to people that are infected when they go to public areas, or for people that are not infected go into rooms of infected people, and that is how the isolation works, but would not be general. It would be at the maximum related and specific to the risk population. So old people with comorbidities and young people that actually have a daily contact with old people. And that is all. Even for kids, before we knew that the innate immunity, like kids are stronger to COVID than other people. I was like, even before that, I was like not putting masks on my daughter because I would expect that her immunity is stronger towards those type of infections. And he was right. I was like, no, I don't think we are the. And even talking about vaccinations today, I keep thinking I would go. I'm willing to be sick. I don't feel like I want to take the vaccine yet. So there's a lot of going on our heads when we're talking about being skeptic about COVID measures. And we have the other side just saying, like, you don't care about people's health, you don't care about people dying, building all this straw man to discredit us. Oh, you're just another anti-vaxxer. It's like, no, why would we be anti? And I'm not anti. I'm just like, if you want to take the vaccine, go ahead. I'm not speaking against the vaccines for other people. I'm not speaking against the masks to other people, but I'm speaking against forcing masks and forcing vaccines on people that choose to take the risk of having corona, like me. Because I believe people young and healthy like me, it would be easier and better to go through an infection. Oh, it's terrible. Yeah, dengue fever, it's the same thing. Malaria, the same thing. And dengue, we have 4 types. You can have dengue 4 times, and you can have a very terrible hemorrhagic type, that is the type 4, and you would die. Even in this type of infections, what we tell people, look, most of them are viruses. You're gonna feel terrible. It's a strong fever, virus infection. It destroys your general body state. Like, you feel like you're gonna die, but you will not. You just need 7 days, lay down. It's a strong flu. It killed a double of people that the flu usually kill yearly. Oh, but then they try to claim, oh, it's because of the lockdown, or would kill more people. And that is the unfalsifiable claim that I keep telling people, that it's like religion. You need to pray to God, or you're going to go to hell. Am I going to go to hell? And they're like, you didn't die, you didn't get sick or anything because of God. It's an unfalsifiable. And the same thing is like, oh, you didn't get corona yet, and not everybody got corona and died because of the measures, because of the lockdown, and because of the masks. It's like, how long we're gonna keep doing this, guys? Because if we're gonna get 1% of the population infected a year, and only 1% of this population got infected dying, I don't think it is enough to lock everybody down. And this conversation, a reasonable conversation like this, you don't see in any mainstream media. What pisses me off?
Well, and what's frightening is that all of our governing systems collapsed. Not only did they suspend constitutional liberties, they did so without going through the evidentiary mechanisms and methods that you're talking about. There was no meaningful scientific debate in the legislative arena because no laws were passed generally. There was no scientific debate within the public health world, within the government space. Instead, there was this sort of mass coercive campaign to go along with a set agenda, an agenda that had never been used before in the history of virus treatment. We've never done mass lockdowns as a mechanism of dealing with the virus. Even the Spanish flu, which was 100 times more lethal than this one is, and much more dangerous to young people than this one is by a long mile, even then, our economy grew. It didn't shrink. We didn't shut down factories and businesses. The only thing we did is we looked at where there's heavy concentration of people indoors. We limited those indoor gatherings, and that's it. We did, and that was only in some cities where there was an outbreak. Nowhere else. Nowhere else did we do this. And the only time we've resorted to a vaccine as a remedy for a flu-like virus was 1976 with the swine flu. We rushed it through. We did under emergency treatment, and it turned out to be a complete disaster. Not only was the virus way exaggerated, the vaccine caused severe medical conditions that were life-changing, and it hurt far more people than it helped. And especially when I hear the words anti-vax or vaccine, it's all a vaccine is a drug. And in this case, it's an experimental drug. And it's an experimental drug for a virus that has never, for a coronavirus, we've never had a 100% successful vaccine for ever in our history. And on top, and going back to your core point, my view is if something is truly good for people, you don't need to force them to do so, that they will do so voluntarily. And that's what our constitutional system says. It says if it's really popular and you have to amend the Constitution, then you will. But don't violate the Constitution in the name of an emergency, because then you don't have a Constitution. That was the great flaw in the Weimar Republic under Germany. It was considered the great liberal constitution of Europe. It had one flaw. It had an emergency exception in it. The chancellor used it. Then the Nazis loved it and ran an 18-wheeler through that loophole and crushed the constitutional liberties of Europe and of Germany. And so we have to remember there can be no emergency exception. Our Constitution was formed between the time of the Revolution and the final passing and ratification of the Constitution. We had 6 serious smallpox outbreaks, and that was a real dangerous virus. You got it, 30% death rate. And yet there's not a word about any exception for viruses in our Constitution. So our founders would find this horrendous, what's happened and what's been done. We have to restore the right of individual liberty, restore constitutional order if we are going to have a constitutional Republican democracy moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Now, how do we fix problems when, like you mentioned, we have the three branches of the government is to try to balance the power and not to let any, and if it was only one power as monarchy or anything, the governor, the ruler could take the power. And then we have these three branches to try to balance the power and nobody overpower each other or to be a tyrant towards the population. But when there are two of the three branches together to, I don't know, crook the elections or force people under some state police situation as we going through now, how should we fight? What is your idea? How we should act now?
There should be mass resistance at all forms. So for some people, that's noncompliance. For some people, that's filing lawsuits or bringing legal challenges. I'm part of bringing legal challenges to mask mandates that are discriminatory against the disabled who can't wear a mask because of their physical condition or medical condition. Working with Robert Kennedy to challenge the lockdowns and forced vaccines in cases that we're planning across the country over the next year. But in addition to that, like one of the places it can start is the smart action a lot of sheriffs have taken. A lot of sheriffs have come out and said, "Look, this is not a constitutionally passed law. The only oath I took as a sheriff was to uphold the Constitution, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to enforce that law. I'm not going to let my police be used to enforce illegal edicts." And they need to do that, or otherwise they too will start losing the respect of the public. Because these laws have not been passed and then the courts need to start enforcing the Constitution and not enforcing unconstitutional rules. But if the courts are going to abscond, if the executive branch is going to abscond, it's going to depend upon local police to not take the wrong actions. Otherwise, our entire system will collapse because people will lose confidence in it. And I don't think our system recognizes how at risk it is of losing the confidence of the population at a level that we haven't seen since the American Revolution itself here in America.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let you go because we're over an hour, and thank you very much for coming. I would love to go a little bit over the Covenant lawsuit, Wesley's and everything, but I'm so thankful for all the time and attention. Thank you very much. Please let people know how they can follow and subscribe and check your content.
Sure. I'm still on Twitter, so at Barnes_law. And then in case I someday get censored or suppressed or disappear from Twitter, like I'm some sort of Argentinian dissident in the 1970s, created an independent board called with a Viva called vivabarneslaw.locals.com. It's part of Dave Rubin's Locals project to create an independent sanctuary that's safe harbored from media censorship and big tech suppression.
That is really important. And I hope to have you here maybe to talk about a little bit of more cancel culture and these corporations and political. Again, thank you very much for coming. I will stop recording. And thank you guys for coming and Happy New Year's to everybody. And see you next video.